Here's something you probably wouldn't expect from the ancient world. Vending machines. Not the kind that gives you a cold drink or a bag of chips, but the idea isn't far off. In the 1st century CE, a Greek engineer named Philo of Byzantium came up with a device that would fit right in at a temple's version of a convenience store. His machine was designed to dispense holy water. Yes, holy water. Automatically when a coin was inserted. You'd drop in a coin, and thanks to a clever system of levers and weights, the machine would open a valve and release a measured amount of water. Once the coin tipped off the balance, the valve shut. No priest, no measuring, no hassle. Just pay, pour, and go. And while it sounds like a novelty, this wasn't just a one-off gimmick. These machines were actually used in Egyptian temples, where people came to perform rituals or make offerings. The vending machine helped regulate access to sacred water, made sure no one took too much, and probably impressed more than a few visitors along the way. It was automation with a spiritual twist. Philo wasn't some tinkerer in the basement either. He was a legitimate inventor and scientist, part of a broader tradition of Greek engineers who weren't afraid to experiment. His other work included mechanical birds, water pumps, and even early thoughts on steam power. Some of his ideas laid the groundwork for later thinkers in the Islamic Golden Age and Renaissance. But this little machine stands out because it's so relatable. Thousands of years later, we still love the same concept. Put in a coin, get something useful or satisfying back. It's kind of funny to think about. You're standing in line at a vending machine today, wondering if your snack will get stuck. And somewhere deep in the past, people were doing the same. Except their prize was a handful of sacred water and maybe some divine forgiveness. The core idea still works. It's a small reminder that human ingenuity and the desire for just a little bit of convenience has been around a lot longer than we tend to think. If you think the idea of a giant, well-organized library is a modern concept, here's something surprising. Over 2,600 years ago, the ancient Assyrians were already doing it, and on a huge scale. The library of Ashurbanipal, built in the 7th century BCE in the city of Nineveh, modern-day Iraq, wasn't just a collection of scrolls or a few scattered tablets. It held over 30,000 clay tablets, carefully cataloged and stored. That's not just impressive for the time, it's staggering. These weren't just government records either. They included epic poems, legal documents, religious texts, medical instructions, astronomical charts, and even letters and administrative memos. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who founded it, wasn't just a ruler with a taste for conquest. He was also a scholar, deeply interested in preserving knowledge. And he didn't leave things to chance. He ordered scribes to collect texts from across Mesopotamia and beyond, even sending officials to foreign cities, just to copy important works. Think of it as one of the first major efforts at cultural preservation. The most famous piece in the library? The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known pieces of literature in the world, was found among these tablets, written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of the time. What's even more interesting is that these tablets were fired in kilns, or hardened by fire, during the destruction of Nineveh, which ironically helped preserve them. If the city hadn't been burned during its fall, much of the collection might not have survived at all. But because of that chaos, we now have insight into what people were reading, studying, and passing down over 2 millennia ago. The library even had a sort of early Dewey Decimal System. Some tablets had marks or labels to help organize them. And get this, some were marked with warnings not to remove them. So yes, overdue tablet policies might be older than we thought. Ashurbanipal's library was a product of empire and ambition, but at its core, it was also about memory, about trying to hold on to knowledge in a world where so much could be lost to war, fire, or time. Today, many of those tablets are housed in museums, studied by scholars who are still translating them, line by line. And every so often, one reveals something new, a forgotten name, a remedy for an ancient illness, a myth once told by firelight. All from a king who wanted his people, and maybe the future, to remember what they knew. Let's head to Japan for something a little unexpected. Massive, ancient burial mounds, shaped like keyholes. They're known as kofun, and they date back to the 3rd to 7th century CE, during what's now called the Kofun period. These weren't ordinary graves. They were elite tombs for emperors, nobles, and powerful clan leaders. Some are absolutely enormous, stretching over 400 meters long. From the sky they look exactly like old keyholes, a circular mound at one end kept to a rectangular biform. And inside, these tombs were filled with treasures, bronze mirrors, weapons, armor, ornaments, and most intriguingly, haniwa, clay figures placed around the tomb, shaped like animals, warriors, dancers, and even houses. We don't know exactly what the haniwa were for, maybe guardians, maybe ceremonial, but they show a deeply symbolic approach to death and remembrance. These tombs weren't just burial sites, they were statements. The size of the kofun often reflected the power of the person inside, and building one took thousands of workers and meticulous planning. The era itself marked a shift in early Japanese society, from smaller clans to a more centralized power structure, and even today, some of these sites remain untouched. The largest, the Daisen Kofun in Osaka, is believed to be the tomb of Emperor Nintoku, and it's so massive that it rivals the Egyptian pyramids in scale. But here's the twist. Because it's classified as an imperial tomb, it's largely off-limits. Archaeologists can't fully excavate it. That means much of what we know about the Kofun period comes from the edges, from smaller tombs and scattered artifacts. It's like trying to piece together a history book with half the pages missing. But still, what's left tells us a lot. It tells us of a time when leaders wanted to leave their mark on the land, not through writing or monuments, but through enormous, carefully designed tombs that still shape the terrain today. Modern concrete doesn't always live up to its promise. Roads crack within a few seasons, seawalls crumble, bridges need constant maintenance. Even brand new buildings start to show wear faster than they should. But Roman concrete, it's held out for over 2,000 years, especially in the places you'd expect it to fail first, in seawater. All across the ancient Mediterranean, structures built by the Romans still stand in the surf, with waves crashing against them every day. Harbors, breakwaters, piers. They're weathered, yes, but intact. So how did they manage that? The answer comes down to their unique recipe. Roman engineers used a blend of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater to create a kind of self-healing concrete. The volcanic ash wasn't just filler. It triggered a chemical reaction when exposed to salt water, forming new minerals inside the concrete over time. One of these minerals, called aluminous tobermory, acts like nature's glue. Instead of wearing down, the concrete actually grew stronger the longer it sat in the water. That's the real twist. Roman marine concrete didn't decay. It evolved. What makes this even more impressive is that they likely figured it out by trial and observation, not by fully understanding the chemistry. The ash came from places like Mount Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples, regions with a lot of geological activity and a lot of experimentation in early construction. The Romans saw what lasted and leaned into it. They used this material in some of the most crucial infrastructure of their empire. Ports, aqueducts, baths, and buildings meant to stand for generations. And in many cases, they did. Modern scientists have spent years trying to reverse engineer this ancient mix to improve our own materials, especially for marine construction. Some researchers even argue that Roman concrete might help us build better structures on the Moon or Mars, where traditional cement won't work. It's a rare case where ancient technology could leap ahead of our own. So, next time you walk past a crumbling sidewalk or a pothole that keeps coming back, remember, there's a recipe from 2,000 years ago that might still be better than the one we're using today. All it took was a little ash, a lot of patience, and a civilization that knew how to build things to last. Here's something you probably didn't learn in school about the Great Pyramid of Giza. It once had a door. Not just any door though. A swiveling slab of stone so precisely balanced that could be opened from the inside with a gentle push. That might sound like a minor architectural detail, but think about it. We're talking about a multi-ton limestone block. Perfectly cut, perfectly fitted, and yet engineered in such a way that a single person inside the pyramid could nudge it open. No hinges, no pulleys, no obvious handles. From the outside, the door blended seamlessly into the pyramid's casing stones, making it nearly invisible. Early explorers reportedly walked past it without ever realizing it was there, and this wasn't a one-off design quirk. The second pyramid at Giza, built for Kaffa, is also said to have had a similar feature, which begs the question, how? How did the ancient Egyptians, over 4,000 years ago, pull off such a mechanical feat using tools made of copper and stone? Theories suggest that the door pivoted on a socket carved into the floor and ceiling, allowing it to rotate vertically, like a hidden trapdoor. It's the kind of clever, precise engineering you don't usually associate with the ancient world. But maybe you should. The Great Pyramid wasn't just a monument. It was a masterclass in design. Every block was placed with intent. The internal chambers, ventilation shafts, and passageways weren't afterthoughts. They were part of a system. And in that context, a secret door that vanished into the wall wasn't just practical, it was part of the mystery. Some have speculated that the door served a symbolic purpose, controlling access to the secret inner chambers. Others think it was a security measure, helping protect the contents of the tomb. Wherever its function, the door is another example of how much we still don't fully understand about ancient Egyptian architecture. It's easy to think of the pyramids as static piles of stone, but they were built by people who were thinking in systems, in mechanics, in long-term design. Even now, with all our technology, we struggle to replicate certain aspects of what they built, especially without leaving a trace. The original swiveling door is no longer there. It's long since been removed or broken apart, likely during one of the many early excavations or looting episodes. But its existence is well documented, and it adds one more quiet, astonishing detail to a structure already full of them. Just imagine standing inside, centuries ago, and pushing against a seamless wall, only to feel it give way effortlessly beneath your hand. Not bad for something built before the invention of iron tools. Now it's time for a fact that flips the usual image of Roman gladiators on its head. Despite their brutal reputation, and the blood-soaked arenas they fought in, most Roman gladiators were actually vegetarians, and they drank tonic made from ashes and vinegar, not exactly what you'd expect from people trained to fight to the death. When we imagine a gladiator, we picture someone on a meat-heavy diet, bulking up with protein for maximum strength. But archaeological studies of gladiator cemeteries, particularly in places like Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, tell a different story. Bone analysis revealed that these warriors consumed a diet heavy in barley, beans, and other plant-based staples. They were sometimes called hordeari, or barley men, by those who trained and wrote about them. But why? Well, a plant-based diet wasn't about ethics. It was about performance. These foods helped gladiators build a layer of subcutaneous fat, which sounds counterintuitive until you realize that in the arena, more fat meant more protection. A deeper cut could look dramatic, but it was less likely to reach anything vital. In short, a gladiator bleeding from a surface wound could put on a good show and still survive the fight. Then there's the tonic. Ashes mixed with vinegar. It sounds strange, maybe even unpleasant, but it had a practical purpose. The ashes, likely from burned plants or bones, were a source of calcium and minerals. Mixed with vinegar, they became a sort of ancient sports drink, meant to help bones recover and keep muscles strong. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder mention this mix in their writings. And it's backed up by traces found in the bones of gladiators studied by scientists. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was a routine part of training. So much of what we assume about the ancient world gets turned on its head when we look at the details. Gladiators weren't just brutes tossed into sandpits, they were professionals, trained and maintained like athletes. Their diets were calculated. Their recovery was monitored. They didn't feast like emperors. They ate like soldiers of spectacle. Simple meals, hard training, and a strange little drink to keep their bones in shape. It's just another example of how the small, overlooked facts of history often tell us more than the headlines ever could. Gladiators might have fought like wild men, but behind the scenes, they lived like disciplined athletes. Bean stew, barley porridge, and all. Let's take a moment to imagine your morning commute. Across rooftops. No roads, no sidewalks, not even alleyways. Just flat, mud brick roofs and wooden ladders, weaving your way from house to house like an ancient game of hopscotch. That's exactly how life worked in Çatalhöyük, one of the oldest known cities in human history. Located in what is now central Turkey, this settlement dates back more than 9,000 years, and it was built with absolutely no streets. Instead, homes were stacked tightly together in a honeycomb-like layout, with people entering their homes, not from the side, but from the top. Roofs doubled as walkways, public spaces, and even gathering areas, which makes modern rooftop bars seem a little less original. To get inside, residents climbed down ladders through openings in the ceiling, stepping directly into their living quarters. It's a layout that might sound inconvenient, but it actually has some clever benefits. Without open streets, settlement was easier to defend. There were no easy paths for invaders to move through. The dense clustering of homes also helped regulate temperature, keeping interiors warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. And let's be honest, if everyone's roof is part of the sidewalk, you've got no excuse for not shoveling the snow. Inside the homes, life was surprisingly sophisticated. Walls were decorated with murals and animal skulls, and residents buried their dead beneath the floors, likely as a way of keeping ancestors close. They farmed, crafted tools, wove fabrics, and maintained a social structure that's still being unraveled today. What's most interesting is how egalitarian Çatalhöyük seems to have been. Archaeologists have found little evidence of social hierarchy. Homes were more or less the same size, and grave goods didn't differ much between individuals. No palaces, no clear rulers, just a community that lived roof to roof, side by side. Some scholars believe this may reflect one of the earliest examples of a truly cooperative urban society. And yet, for all its uniqueness, Çatalhöyük feels strangely familiar. People cooked meals, raised children, gathered together, and most importantly, figured out a way to make it all work, even without roads. In a way, it's like an ancient version of a close-knit apartment complex, only with fewer elevators and more ladders. Today, the ruins of Çatalhöyük are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they continue to offer insights into the very roots of city life. From high above, the remains still resemble that clustered rooftop maze, frozen in time. And when you think about how humans have been finding creative ways to live together for nearly 10,000 years, well, maybe your next walk across a crowded street doesn't seem so complicated after all. Imagine flushing your toilet in the year 2500 BCE. Sounds ridiculous, right? But if you lived in the Indus Valley civilization, say, in one of its great cities, like Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, that's more or less what you were doing. Thousands of years before indoor plumbing became a staple of modern life, this ancient civilization had already figured out the basics of public sanitation, and not just in a primitive, hole-in-the-ground kind of way. We're talking about well-laid brick drains running along streets, private toilets in individual homes, and even soak pits to filter wastewater. The cities were planned with such precision that some archaeologists have called them the Manhattans of the Bronze Age. Homes were often built with their own bathrooms, connected to a city-wide drainage system, and large public wells provided fresh water to neighborhoods. Some buildings even had early versions of showers. Just pour water over yourself with a jug, and let it run down into a covered drain. Honestly, you could argue that parts of the Indus Valley were more hygienic than many 19th century European cities, where raw sewage still flowed in open gutters and outbreaks of cholera were an unfortunate routine. The streets in Mohenjo-daro were laid out in a grid, houses had ventilation systems, and trash was kept outside in designated areas. It wasn't just advanced, It was thoughtful. People weren't simply surviving, they were designing spaces to live comfortably and cleanly. And the most incredible part, we still don't fully understand how they organized it all. The Indus script remains undeciphered, so there's no Rosetta Stone to tell us who planned these cities, or how they governed them. No big palaces, no flashy tombs, just practical, efficient, urban design that quietly got the job done. It's one of those historical reminders that advanced thinking doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it's found in brickwork and water flow, and for anyone who's ever cursed a blocked sink or a questionable public restroom, the Indus Valley offers a comforting thought. People have been trying to make modern life more livable for thousands of years, and in some ways, they did a pretty remarkable job of it. So next time your city has a plumbing issue, just remember, Bronze Age engineers might have done it better. If you think brain surgery sounds like a modern invention, think again, because ancient Peruvians were performing it over 1,000 years ago, and honestly, they were surprisingly good at it. In fact, they were better at it than 19th century battlefield surgeons. The practice was called trepanation, and it involved removing sections of the skull, often to relieve pressure from head trauma, usually injuries sustained in battle. Sounds brutal, right? But the survival rate was shockingly high. Over 80%, according to studies of hundreds of skulls found in burial sites across the Andes. And this wasn't just one fluke operation. Some individuals had multiple trepanation holes, suggesting they not only survived the first time, but went in for a second or even third procedure. You can imagine the scene. No anesthesia, no sterile surgical suite, just skilled hands, sharp tools made of obsidian or bronze, and centuries of handed-down knowledge. And they weren't just sawing into heads randomly either. Evidence shows they had different techniques: scraping, drilling, and cutting in neat geometric shapes, all depending on the type of injury or the tools available. Some trepanations were even done in ways that carefully avoided damaging the brain or major blood vessels. And remarkably, signs of healing around the holes prove that patients didn't just survive, they recovered. How did they prevent infection? What did they use for pain relief? We can only guess. Maybe herbal poultices, maybe coca leaves, maybe just high tolerance for discomfort. But what's clear is this: ancient Andean surgeons were methodical, experienced, and likely respected members of their communities. Trepanation wasn't a fringe practice. It was widespread, and it worked. In comparison, Civil War doctors in the 1800s had a much lower survival rate for similar cranial procedures, often because of infections and lack of surgical technique. So while we might think of ancient medicine as crude or superstitious, here's proof that in some areas, our ancestors were surprisingly ahead of their time. The next time someone tells you ancient people didn't know what they were doing, just point to the Peruvians, calmly removing chunks of skull and sending patients home to heal. Not bad for a civilization with no MRIs, no antibiotics, and no modern tools. Just steady hands, sharp blades, and knowledge passed down through generations. Before New York had its skyline, before Rome had its roads, there was Uruk, a city so old that it makes most of what we consider ancient seem like yesterday's news. Around 3000 BCE, Uruk was already buzzing with life. And we're not talking about a sleepy little settlement here. This place had over 50,000 people, which for the time was basically a metropolis. If you picture a crowd that size now, that's enough for a packed football stadium. Except this crowd didn't have digital screens or popcorn stands. They had mud brick temples, ziggurats, and some of the earliest known forms of writing. The city was a key center in what's now modern-day Iraq. And it didn't just grow by accident. It was a hub of innovation, trade, religion, and power. In fact, Uruk is often credited with being the birthplace of urban life as we know it. It had administrative systems, complex social structure, and possibly even zoning, thousands of years before anyone coined the term urban planning. The people of Uruk weren't just piling up houses, they were organizing the city. There were specialized workers, temples to the goddess Inanna, grain storage facilities, and massive public works. It was also home to one of history's first known kings, Gilgamesh, whose legend would become one of the world's earliest pieces of literature. And sure, Uruk didn't have plumbing or high-speed internet, but they had something arguably more impressive: the invention of writing. Cuneiform tablets found at Uruk show early accounting records, trade lists, and even recipes. Because of course, even in ancient times, someone had to keep track of the barley. The city's size and structure suggests a population that wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. People came from surrounding regions to trade goods, worship at the temples, and probably complain about the crowds. And if you're wondering how a city like that functioned without cars or modern logistics, well, they used canals, footpaths, and a whole lot of clever management. Uruk set the blueprint for what a city could be. It was dense, it was organized, and it had enough going on to attract tens of thousands of people to live, work, and worship within its walls. And that's not just impressive for 5,000 years ago, that's impressive, period. So next time someone says modern life is overwhelming, just remember, ancient Mesopotamians were dealing with traffic jams of carts and goats before most of us even figured out farming. Ever think your last medical bill was a bit harsh? Try practicing medicine under the Code of Hammurabi. Back in ancient Babylon, around 1750 BCE, laws weren't just concerned with theft or property. They also spelled out exactly what a doctor could charge, and more importantly, what happened if things went wrong. Hammurabi's Code is one of the oldest known sets of laws in human history, carved into stone for everyone to see and fear. And in the middle of all the edicts about irrigation rights and broken contracts, there's an entire section devoted to medical procedures. If a doctor performed surgery and saved someone's life, they were paid handsomely, sometimes in silver, sometimes in livestock, depending on the patient's social class. But if a doctor made a mistake, if they caused harm instead of healing, the punishment could be, well, a bit more permanent. For example, if a physician caused the death of a wealthy patient, or made them lose an eye, the law often demanded that the doctor's hand be cut off. Yes, their literal hand, the same one they used for surgery. Which, as you can imagine, put a fair amount of pressure on getting things right the first time. This wasn't a world of malpractice insurance or second opinions. It was swift justice, delivered with a chisel and a very clear sense of consequence. On the one hand, it shows how seriously medicine was taken. Healing wasn't a side gig, it was a respected profession, and those who practiced it were held to high standards. On the other, it reveals just how differently accountability was enforced. Mistakes didn't end in a lawsuit, they ended in amputation. Still, the inclusion of these laws says something pretty remarkable about Babylonian society. It had structure, it had bureaucracy, and it had an understanding that skilled labor, like surgery, was valuable enough to protect and risky enough to regulate. The fact that they had building codes and features thousands of years ago is both oddly relatable and a little terrifying. And it wasn't just surgery either. There were laws about midwives, veterinarians, and even barbers. Everyone from the elite to the everyday was touched in some way by Hammurabi's stone-carved expectations. It might sound brutal by today's standards, but in a way, it laid the groundwork for holding professionals accountable. So next time you grumble about a copay, just be glad the worst you'll face is a bill. Because back then, one botched incision, and you'd be out of the job, and out of a hand. What do you think it takes to predict an eclipse? Today we have satellites, computers, and complex models. But over 2,500 years ago, long before telescopes or even the idea of modern science, the Babylonians were already doing it with surprising precision, using nothing more than careful observation, clay tablets, and centuries of recorded patterns. They learned how to track the rhythms of the sky. And somehow, from that, they figured out how to predict when the moon would go dark. These weren't just guesses. Babylonian astronomers developed mathematical methods to forecast lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They recorded the movements of the moon and planets for generations, noticing patterns that repeated over time. One of their greatest tools was something called the sorrow cycle, a period of about 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after which lunar and solar eclipses tend to repeat. They didn't invent the sorrow cycle, but they figured it out, and they used it, not just to predict that an eclipse might happen sometime, but to narrow down the date, time, and even part of the sky. To do this, they relied on tablets like the famous astronomical diaries found in the ruins of Babylon. These tablets are packed with detailed observations: what the sky looked like each night when a certain star rose, how long the moon took to cross the sky. Some tablets include eclipse omens, beliefs about what these events might mean. But many are surprisingly objective. Just data. Careful notes. The same way a scientist might track the temperature every day for years. And why did they care so much? For the Babylonians, the heavens weren't just a source of wonder. They were a kind of divine calendar. Eclipses could signal important changes, warnings of kings, omens of war or peace. But before they could interpret them, they had to understand them. That meant watching, recording, calculating. Generation after generation of scribes copying down what they saw, slowly building a system that could look forward as well as back. What's even more remarkable is that they did all of this with no concept of gravity, no understanding of orbital mechanics, just the sky above them, and the clay beneath their hands. And yet, their predictions were good enough that later cultures, including the Greeks, built on their methods. It's a quiet reminder of how much patience and curiosity can achieve. No supercomputers, no telescopes, just a deep love of the sky, passed down in writing, in numbers, in stories written in stars.